N. Open plains from her porch. Margaret's days were predictable. Her granddaughter, Emma, visited weekly to bring groceries and keep her company. But most of the time, Margaret was alone, her heart longing for the freedom she once knew. The plains stretched endlessly. Beyond her backyard, a reminder of what was lost, and the wild Bodhi that still thrived done crisp morning. As Margaret wheeled herself out to enjoy the gentle sun, she noticed something unusual. Alone, Mustang stood at the edge of her property. Unlike the others that usually stayed far from human dwellings, this one was closer, too close. Its dark, shiny coat glistened under the sunlight, and its sharp and curious seemed to lock onto her. Sat first. Margaret froze. Wild horses didn't approach people. They avoided them. But this Mustang did move away. Instead, it stepped cautiously forward, its hooves crunching the dry grass. Margaret felt their pulse. Quickened, she clutched the arms of her wheelchair, her breath catching as the Mustang came within 20 feet of her. "What are you doing here?" she murmured softly, her voice trembling. The horse flicked its ears as though it understood her words. Margaret's heart dashed. She watched the creatures of reservoir of life standing before her. A pang of envy surged through her. She had spent 2 decades yearning for the kind of freedom this Mustang represented. The moment was broken when the Mustang suddenly turned and bolted, disappearing over the hill as quickly as it had appeared. Margaret sat there, her hands trembling. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of wonder, a flicker of the spirits had thought she'd lost. When Emma arrived later that day, Margaret recounted the encounter. A wild horse came up to him, as she said, her voice tinged with awe. Emma laughed gently, as assuming it was another one of her grandmother's vivid memories of the past. Maybe it was just a dream, Grandma, but Margaret knew it wasn't a dream. That Mustang had come to her for areas, and deep down she felt that their story wasn't over. The following morning, Margaret wheeled herself out to her usual spot on the porch. The sun was just casting a warm orange glow over the endless plains. She scanned the horizon, her heart silently hoping to catch of the mysterious Mustang. Hours passed, and the day carried on as usual, quiet and uneventful. But just as Margaret was about to return inside, she heard the faint rhythmic sound of hooves against the ground. Her breath caught as she turned her gaze toward the plains. There it was, the same Mustang from the day before. The horse approached slowly, its movements cautious but deliberate. Margaret's heart pounded. She had seen many old horses over the years, but none had ever shown this level of curiosity or boldness. This time, the Mustang came even closer, stopping mere feet away from her porch. It stood there, its eyes studying her, as though trying to understand the frail woman before it. Margaret reached out instinctively, her hand trembling. "Hey there," she whispered. The Mustang didn't move, but flared its nostrils, breathing in her scent. The connection between them felt almost tangible, as if the horse recognized something in Margaret that others couldn't. This time, the Mustang didn't bolt. Instead, it lingered, grazing nearby while keeping her in its peripheral vision. Margaret sat in silence, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Notice a frail old woman in a wheelchair, but as someone worthy of attention and connection. As the days passed, the Mustang began appearing more frequently. Each visit brought it closer to Margaret's porch, and she began leaving out small buckets of water for its hen, named the horse Shadow because of its sleek dark coat that seemed to blend with the dusk. Emma, however, remained skeptical when Margaret shared her experiences. "Wild horses don't just walk up to people, Grandma. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the wild recognizes the broken, Emma, and maybe it sees something in Meth that you don't." But note, everyone in the town viewed Shadow's presence with the same reverence as Margaret did a local rancher. Tom had spotted the horse near his cattle. "That Mustang's trouble," he warned Margaret in the afternoon. "They spook the herds, and it starts hanging around here. Someone's bound to go after it." Margaret's chest tightened. She knew the dangers wild Mustangs faced, being captured or worse, killed for wandering too close to human territory. Shadow was no exception, and the thought of losing this unexpected connection filled her with dread. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch watching, and the plain Shadow appeared once more, this time venturing closer than ever. As Margaret looked into the horse's eyes, she felt a deep resolve. If the world was against shadows, she would do everything in her power to protect them, even if it meant going against the very people she had called neighbors for decades. Shadow's visits became a daily occurrence each morning. Margaret wheeled herself to the porch, her heart lifting the moment she saw the dark figure against the golden plains. The Mustang's cautious nature began to soften, and Margaret found herself speaking to him in the same tender voices he once used with her beloved horses years ago. "Good morning, Shadow," she said one sunny afternoon, holding out a carrot in her wrinkled hand. Shadow hesitated at first, this ears flicking back and forth as she assessed the situation. Then slowly and deliberately he stepped forward, his nostrils flaring. Ash sniffed the offered treat. Margaret held her breath, afraid that the slightest movement might scare him off. But to her amazement, Shadow took the carrot from her hand, his soft lips brushing against their palm. Margaret's laughter rang out pure and unrestrained, echoing across the plains. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years, a laugh born of joy, not of politeness or obligation. Shadow stayed close that day, grazing in the yard as Margaret Satan watched, her heart swelling with a sense of purposes. He thought she'd lost long ago. Word of the wild Mustang's unusual behavior began to spread through the small-town neighbors. Stopped by curious about the stories they'd heard, some marveled at the bond between Margaret and Shadow, while others, like Tom the rancher, saw the horse as a nuisance. That animal doesn't belong here. Margaret, Tom said one afternoon, his voice stern, "You're just encouraging him to stay, and that's not good for anyone. Wild horses need to be out there, no thanging around." People. Margaret met this gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "He's not bothering anyone, Tom, he's just looking for something, and so I dispute Tom's warnings." Margaret continued to nurture her bond with Shadows. She began leaving out hay and fresh water, setting up a small area in earth, a porch where the horse could safely rest. Shadow's trust her grew with each he allowed her to stroke his neck, her frail fingers tracing the contours of his powerful muscles. For Margaret, these moments were more than just a connection to a wild animal. They were a lifeline. Each touch, each gentle nicker from Shadow seemed to erase years of loneliness and pain in him. She saw a reflection of her own spirit, wild, untamed, and yearning for freedom, despite the odds. But the peace between Margaret and Shadow was short-lived. One afternoon, as Shadow grazed near the house, a loud engine roared in the distance. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the sound of Tom's truck pulling up the driveway. He stepped out, his expression grim. "Margaret, I've warned you, that horse has been spotted near my cattle again. If he causes any trouble, the authorities won't think twice about taking him down, and I won't be able to stop them." Margaret's voice wavered, but her resolve was firm. "Shadow isn't causing trouble, Tom. He's just lost, like so many of Zor." Our Tom sighed, shaking his head. "You can't save every wild thing, Margaret. Sometimes it's just the way." Off the world that night, Margaret sat on her porch here, scanning the dark horizon. Shadow stood nearby, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. As she watched him, ate his lip down her cheeks. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, but now for the first time she had something worth fighting for. A week later, the calm of the plains was shattered by dark clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air was heavy, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain. Margaret sat on her porch, watching the sky darken, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. Shadow hadn't visited Diet that day, and an eyes nodded there as the first drops of rain began to fall. Margaret's worry deepened. Shadow's visits had become so regular that his absence now felt like a missing piece of her day. By the time the storm hit in full force, with wind howling and rain lashing against their windows, she could barely sit still. The plains, usually a picture of serenity, now looked menacing under the flashing lightning. Margaret wheeled herself closer to the window, her heart pounding with fear for the wild horses. She had now a way of knowing if Shadow had found shelter, or if he was braving the storm out in the open. The night stretched on the storms, showing no signs of relenting. Margaret barely slept, their thoughts consumed by Shadow. At dawn, the rain finally eased, leaving the plains soaked and glistening. She hurried to the porch, scanning the landscape for any sign of her companion. Her breath caught when she spotted him. Shadow was limping, his dark coat matted with mud and water. He was moving slowly, his usual grace replaced by a painful shuffle. Margaret's heart broke at the sight. Without thinking, she called out to him, "Shadow, over here." The Mustang's ears perked up at her voice. Despite his injury, he hobbled toward her, each step a visible struggle. When he finally reached the porch, Margaret saw the cause of his limp aid, gash on his front leg, likely from debris thrown around by the storm. Margaret's hands trembled as she wheeled herself closer to him. "Shadows," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're hurt." She knew she couldn't leave him like this, but treating a wild horse was no small task. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against this damp coat. Shadow flinched at first, but didn't retreat, taking it as a sign of trust. Margaret grabbed a clean towel and some antiseptic from the house. She worked carefully, her movements she cleaned the wound. Shadow stood still, his dark eyes watching her with an almost human intensity as she worked. Margaret realized how fragile this connection was. Shadow was a creature of the wild, and any prolonged contact with humans could put him at risk. Either he was trusting her in a moment of vulnerability. The news of Shadow's injury spread quickly through the town. Some neighbors expressed concern, while others, like Tom, saw it as further proof that the Mustang was alienability. "You can't keep nursing that horse, Margaret," Tom warned. "If he gets dependent on you, he'll lose what makes him wild, and if he starts wandering near people, someone's going to report him." Margaret refused to listen. He came to him because he needed help. She said firmly, "Isn't that what we're supposed to do, help when we can't?" The following days were a test of both Margaret's resolve and Shadow's strength. She tended to his wound as best he could, even enlisting Emma's help to bring fresh hay and water closer to the house. Shadow's limp began to improve, but Margaret knew the clock wasting the longer he stayed, the more likely it was that someone would take action. Against them an evening, as Margaret sat on the porch with Shadow grazing nearby, she made aslant vows she'd protect him no matter what, even if it meant confronting the town or risking her own safety. She couldn't let Shadow pay the price for simply existing. Shadow's recovery was steady but slow, his limp lessened with each passing day. And Margaret's bond with him grew stronger every morning. She would find him waiting near the porch, his dark coat gleaming under the rising sun. Margaret's days, marked by loneliness, were now filled with purpose. Shadow had reignited a spark within her, and for the first time in years she felt truly alive, but no everyone shared her joy. Tom's warnings escalated into outright threats. Margaret said one afternoon, standing on her porch with his hand, "The county's been hearing complaints about a Mustang hanging too close to human property. They're sending a team out next week to round him up." The word "shit" Margaret like a punch to the gut. "Round him up? You mean take him to one of those holding facilities?" She asked, her voice trembling. Tom sighed, his expressions of tending it's for the best. Margaret, "Wild horses can't stay near people. It's dangerous for the man for us." Margaret shook her head, her grip tightening on the arms of her wheelchair. "He's not dangerous, Tom. He's just was trying to survive like the rest of us." But deep down, she knew the odds were stacked against her. Wild Mustangs were often placed in overcrowded holding pens or sold off to questionable buyers. The thought of Shadow losing his freedom was unbearable. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch staring out at the plains. Shadow stood nearby, his strong, graceful forms silhouetted against the fading lights. She couldn't bear the idea of him being taken away. But what could she, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, possibly do to stop it? The answer came unexpectedly the next day. Emma arrived for her weekly visit, and Margaret shared the news about the roundup. To her surprise, Emma didn't dismiss her concerns. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "What if we moved him somewhere safer?" Emma suggested there's that wildlife sanctuary a few towns over. They have land set aside for Mustangs. It's not the wild, but it's better than a holding pen. Margaret's eyes lit up with hope. "You think they'd take him? I can call and find out," Emma said, already pulling out her phone. The sanctuary's response was encouraging. They agreed to take Shadow, provided he could be safely transported. But the logistics were daunting. Catching and moving a wild horse was no easy feat, and Margaret knew Shadow wouldn't trust anyone else the way he trusted her. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning. Emma arranged for a horse trailer and enlisted the help of a local veterinarian to ensure Shadow's safety during transport. Margaret, meanwhile, spent as much time as possible with Shadow, preparing him for the journey. She spoke to him softly, explaining what was about to happen. Even though she wasn't sure he could understand when the day of the move arrived, the tension was palpable. The vet and Emma worked carefully to guide Shadow toward the trailer, using coaxing in Margaret's presence to keep him calm. Shadow's unease was clear. His ears flicked back and forth, and he stomped the ground nervously. "It's okay, boy," Margaret said from her wheelchair, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You're going to a place where you'll be safe. I promise." After what felt like an eternity, Shadow stepped into the trailer. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She had done what she thought was best, but the sight of Shadow confined in the trailer was almost too much to be harassed. The trailer pulled away. Margaret sat on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The plane stretched out before her, empty and quiet. A single tear slid down her cheeks. She had fought for Shadow, but the weight of their parting was heavier than she had anticipated. As the trailer disappeared over the horizon, Margaret's porch felt emptier than it had in years. Shadow's presence had filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep. Now she sat grappling with the bittersweet mix of relief and loss. She had fought to save him, but the price of doing so was a parting. She wasn't ready for. Emma called later that day to reassure her grandma, "Shadow's going to between at the sanctuary is beautiful. Rolling hills, plenty of space to roam. He'll be happy there." Margaret nodded, though Emma could see her through the phone. "I know it's the right thing," she said softly, "but it doesn't make it easier." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Margaret's mind replayed the moment. Shadow stepped into the trailer, his dark eyes filled with trust and uncertainty. She wondered if he felt betrayed, if he'd forgive her for sending him away. The following days were a blur of silence. Margaret's routine returned to its old rhythm, but nothing felt the same. The PL once to live with Shadow's presences seemed vast and hollow. She missed the sound of his hose, the gentle way he grazed nearby, and the connection they had shared. Then a week after Shadow's departure, Emma arrived with the unexpected news. "The sanctuary invited us to visit," she said with a smile. "They want you to see how he's doing." Margaret's heart leaped. The thought of seeing Shadow again filled her with a sense of purpose as she hadn't felt in days. "When can we go?" she asked eagerly. The trip was arranged for the following weekend. Emma helped Margaret into the car, her wheelchair securely packed in the trunk as they drove. Margaret stared out at the passing landscapes, her thoughts consumed by Shadow. Would he remember her? Would he still trust? After everything, the sanctuary was nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. As they pulled into the driveway, Margaret's breath caught the sight of open pastures filled with grazing mustangs. Was breathtaking. A staff member greeted them warmly and led them to Shadow's enclosure. Margaret's hands trembled with anticipation as they approached, and then she saw him. Shadow stood near the edge of the fence, his dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. He was no longer limping, and his stance had regained the proud, confident air of a wild horse. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she wheeled closer. "Shadow," she called softly. The Mustang's ears twitched, and he turned toward her for a moment. He stood still, the sound of her voice. Then, to everyone's amazement, he walked toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. Margaret extended her hand, her heart pounding as Shadow lowered his head. His soft muzzle brushed against their palm, and the tears she had been holding back spilled freely. "You remember me?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The staff member smiled. "He's been thriving here, but it's clear you have a special bond with him." Margaret spent hours with Shadow that day, speaking to him in the same tender voice as she always had. She stroked his neck, feeling the strength of the creature she had fought so hard to protect. When it was time to leave, Margaret's heart ached. But it was different. This time, she knew Shadow was safe, free to live. She was meant to. As she said her goodbye, she whispered, "Happy, Shadow, you'll always have a piece of my heart." As Margaret and Emma drove home from the sanctuary, the silence in the car was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, quiet of loneliness, but a peaceful stillness filled with the satisfaction of knowing Shadow was safe for the first time in years. Margaret felt like she had truly made a difference. The days that followed were brighter. Margaret spent their mornings on the porch, not waiting for Shadow to appear, but simply enjoying the beauty of the plains. She still missed him, of course, but the knowledge that he was thriving brought her quiet joy. She began writing in a journal, documenting her time with Shadow and the lessons she had taught there about resilience, trust, and the power of connection. Word of Margaret's bond with Shadow spread through the small-town neighbors, who once dismissed her stories, now stopped by to ask about the Mustang. Even Tom, the gruff rancher, who had once viewed Shadow as a nuisance, paid her a visit. "I heard you got them into that sanctuary," he said, tipping his hat. "Guess I was wrong about you. You took guts to do what you did." Margaret smiled. Harry's twinkling had taught more about courage than ever could have taught them. Emma, inspired by her grandmother's journey, began volunteering at the sanctuary on weekends. She would return with stories of Shadow, who had become something of a legend among the staff. "They say he's a leader," Emma told Margaret an evening. "He's always the first to explore new pastures, and the other horses follow him. It's like he knows she's free." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She knew Shadow had always been special, and hearing about his thriving life at the sanctuary was their assurance as she needed. One day, Emma suggested hosting a small fundraiser to support the sanctuary. Margaret eagerly agreed, offering to share her story as part of the event. The gathering was held in her backyard with neighbors, friends, and even some sanctuary staff in attendance. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, looking out at the familiar faces. She took a deep breath and began, "I spent years feeling trapped by my circumstances, my body and my own mind. But then a wild Mustang came into my life." Shadow reminded me that freedom isn't just about where you are, it's about how you choose to live. Her words moved the crowd, and by the end of the evening, they had raised enough funds to help care for several more Mustangs at the sanctuary. Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that Shadow's story was making a difference far beyond her own life. As these seasons changed, Margaret's connection with Shadow remained strong. Emma often took her to visit the sanctuary, where Shadow would greet her with the same gentle nuzzle. Each visit reinforced the unspoken bond between them, a bond that had transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the golden sunlight stretch across the plains. She thought about Shadow running free in the sanctuary's vast pastures, leading his herd with the same strength and grace that had drawn her to him in the first place. As miles spread across her face, as she whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Shadow, for reminding me what it means to truly live." Margaret's life had been changed forever by a wild Mustang, and thought their time together had been brief. The lesson she had left behind would echo her heart for the rest of her days. Margaret and Shadow's story is a testament to the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and animals. Their connection wasn't just about survival, it was about finding hope, healing, and courage in the face of life's challenges. Shadow's journey to safety and freedom reflected Margaret's own rediscovery of purpose and resilience. If this story touched your heart, remember that every small act of kindness can create a ripple of change. Let Margaret and Shadow's story inspire you to see the beauty and the connections around you, no matter how unexpected they may be. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to her channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of hope and courage. Together we can continue hearing these inspiring tales that remind us of the extraordinary power of compassion.